If you all will take your seats, we will begin. I'd like to begin at 8:30, and it is 8:30. Everybody, if you please take your seats, we will begin. Thank you so much. Welcome to New York Law School. I'm Ross Sandler, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for New York City Law, and this program is co-sponsored with our Center for Real Estate Studies. I'm really delighted to see so many people here, and of course it's to welcome Christine Quinn to New York Law School. Christine Quinn, this is the second time she's been willing to come to New York Law School and speak. She did it in 2008, and now as the election season heats up, she is willing to come back, and I'm delighted to welcome her here. Christine Quinn went to the council in 1999 and became the speaker in 2006. I participated in government, as many of you did, back when the Board of Estimate was around, and saw the 1989 Charter Revision Commission eliminate the Board of Estimate and then create a strong council. And I remember distinctly the issues at that time was how strong would the council be? What kind of a counterweight would it be to a strong mayor? Those were profoundly difficult issues that were wrestled with at that time. And but now looking back, we have the years that passed that have allowed us to see just how the council has matured and how its leadership has matured. And a key person, perhaps the most important person in that period of time, has been Christine Quinn, who has led a diverse council, a council that had to deal with a very strong mayor and had to lead in the way she did in the city through conciliation, through leadership, through legislation, through the ability to bring people together. And I cite only one example of that. In her wonderful speech this week on the state of the city, she mentioned 30 other members of the city council. In other words, what she did is a collegial government that she has led, and that has been part of the strength that she has brought to the council. It is an important leadership quality, and we are delighted to welcome Christine Quinn to this podium to address our audience here at New York Law School.
Well, Ross, thank you very much. And I was just reminiscing on the way in. When I first got elected to the city council in 1999, we had this big problem in the neighborhood around kind of a renegade tour bus company. And it really became an enormous problem. This company was running up bad depots right next to people's homes. They weren't following the rules of the road. A man was killed, hit by a tour bus over by Manhattan Plaza, and we couldn't break through. And the court appointed a special magistrate to help us figure out, if I say exactly any of the legal terms wrong, just ignore me and see Rob Newman or Liz Fine from my office later, our general counsel, legislative director, and they can fill you in on exactly what I meant in a legal perspective. But Ross was that individual who met seemingly endlessly with me and Tom Duane and Dick Gottfried and other folks and Scott Stringer to try to resolve this. So I feel I can never say no to Ross when he asked me to do something, because he was such a huge help to us on the West Side. But he did just remind me that I told him exactly how he was supposed to fix it for the West Side, which I can't imagine I was that pushy. But thank you all for being here this morning. I got an email this morning from, I guess, Dean Crowell now, we have to call Anthony, who's was planning to be here this morning, but I don't know, some blah, blah, blah about an all deans, blah, blah. It got very academic. I stopped reading it. You know, it's great to still have Anthony downtown and really Anthony was a terrific resource to us in the city council as we worked on complicated issues like lobbying laws and campaign finance reform, and he was a great partner to us, and it's great having him still here in downtown Manhattan. And this law school, which has been the law school that our minority leader went to, Jimmy Otto, a lot of folks in government have been able to get law degrees while going to school at night and still working through New York Law School, and you are just a great resource to all of us at City Hall. So I just want to thank Anthony and everybody here for that. And I just want to particularly also mention, I know Anthony is launching a new public service scholarship program and a new Center for Business and Financial Law, and we just want to applaud him for that and his efforts to grow this institution to an even stronger, better place and give folks the opportunity to move on to law degrees as they've figured while working that that's something that they need to do. I also want to thank, I see lots of different folks from the administration here, our finance commissioner, our deputy chancellor, Kathleen Grimm, a bunch of other folks, so thank you all for being here. So I hate to start on an antagonistic note after Ross's lovely introduction, but I do want to pat the council on the back a little bit in that we had an important victory yesterday in the courts as it relates to the mayor's homeless policy. But let me first just say, you know, one of the things that I've tried to do in the past 7 years is get as much done as we could possibly get done. And if you're going to get things done in government, that means the legislature and the executive have to work together. And it means when you can't work together, you have to do it agreeably. Now, about a year or so ago, we ended up doing something fairly unorthodox, taking Mayor Bloomberg to court over this policy I'll talk about in a second. Somebody asked me at one point what that meant about my relationship with the mayor. I said, nothing, we're not dating. It means we disagree on homeless policy. Next, let's move on. And I remember telling the mayor that story, and he laughed like crazy because it was like, right, you can't agree on everything. But as long as you actually feel strongly about what your thing is that you disagree on and do it agreeably, you can continue to work collaboratively and go from that one room where you disagreed into the next room where you're going to agree. This issue was one where the Department of Homeless Services wanted to take a policy that Mayor Giuliani had put in place around screening homeless families in a manner that I thought when Giuliani did it was mean-spirited and overly aggressive and counterproductive, because the vast majority of families who get rejected because they didn't quote-unquote prove that they had nowhere else to go actually reapply and end up coming right back. So all it does is delay their time in the shelter system and put them clearly in a worse place. But for us in the council, the issue was more specific, in that we believed when the mayor's office, Department of Homeless Services, wanted to apply this same rule to homeless singles, it was a rule. It needed to go through rulemaking. It needed to go through the city, no, what the heck? Yeah, what does it stand for? Okay, Citywide Administrative Procedure Act. I can never remember all the letters, but CAPA, because that's how you make rules, how agencies make rules. And the process of rulemaking is extremely important to us in the council, because we often in legislation will say this has to be implemented through an agency's rulemaking process. So if an agency is not holding rulemaking to the highest level of transparency in the letter of the law, it undercuts our ability as the legislature to write laws, because we often write laws with a leap of faith that the agency is going to implement them as prescribed under the provisions of CAPA. That didn't happen here. Now, the Coalition for the Homeless, Legal Aid Society will tell you this is a violation of the Callahan decision, of which I agree with that, and I share their substantive concerns. But for us, it was about this rulemaking. And the court yesterday ruled unanimously that, in fact, we were right, that the mayor's office had violated rulemaking and therefore could not implement this new policy. So from my perspective, it's a very significant victory for homeless families. But it's also an important victory for the balance of power and democracy, and that government has to be conducted in an open and transparent way. And I really want to just give a big shout out to our general counsel's office. Liz Fine, our general counsel, is here, and her chief litigator, Jeff Metzler, who was the one who actually won the case yesterday and really did a terrific job. So congratulations to Liz and Jeff Metzler. Those of you who are lawyers, you'll have to get more specifics on the legal stuff from Liz, but it was an important, I think, victory. Let me just talk quickly about two other general things, and then I'd be happy to take folks' questions. On Monday, as was said, I gave my State of the City speech, and which will be my final State of the City speech as Speaker. And what we laid out in that speech was what we hope a blueprint for focus and forward motion for the middle class in New York City and those who are aspiring and working so hard to get into the middle class. On Monday morning, in advance of the speech, we released a report called The Middle Class Squeeze, which did an analysis of where the middle class is, and we're using basically, say, $65,000 to $175,000 for a family of four to define middle class in New York City. Our middle class has a 6.2% unemployment rate today. If you compare that to other points of where this level or time of recovery out of a recession, to other similar times in coming out of a recession, it is a much higher unemployment rate than usual. One of the challenges there is that good middle class paying jobs are not as many as there used to be. Two, the report showed that the affordability level in this city is also rising. So in addition to having an employment challenge, you have an affordability crisis, with housing topping the list as the most expensive thing. Unfortunately, not so far behind childcare. On average, New Yorkers are spending $19,000 a year on childcare. So that's why in the speech we laid out a 4-point plan for developing what I believe would be the biggest middle-class housing program in 2 generations, the biggest middle-class housing program since Mitchell-Lama. Part of that is more aggressively working to preserve every housing unit we have. Part of that is taking the 100,000, working towards taking the 100,000 units in this city of rental housing that are on the verge of foreclosure and kind of structural collapse, bringing those back. 3, it's new construction and putting in allocations from the capital budget, actually borrowing. This is a time to responsibly borrow given how low the interest rates are, redirecting other unspent and allocated money in the capital budget to this effort, which I just think is so important. Also using property tax caps and other techniques to convert units that are market rate to affordability for the middle class, but trying to do also all of this with something we've never really done on this level before, a great deal of this housing becoming permanently affordable, so we don't repeat the mistakes of Mitchell-Lama where you 20 or 30 years from now have your kind of home pulled out from under you. We've also proposed that to deal with the child care challenge, we've introduced legislation in Albany to create a child care tax credit. Right now, the tax credit basically taps out in the city level at folks making $30,000, which is, we need that, but that's obviously not particularly helpful for most middle-class families. We would propose raising that to about $180,000. You pair that with the pre-existing state and federal ones after our credit goes through, that could be a savings of $2,040 for the average New Yorker, which is actually a really helpful amount of money. Now, there's another thing we talked about in this speech that I really want to underscore, because the things I just mentioned are important, and we need to do them, and we need to work immediately for them. But there's something in the speech we talked about that is on literally a time clock. I know we were all thrilled when President Obama put in place the opportunity for the young dreamers, as we call them, to stay in the United States. But to do that, you have to be enrolled in an educational program. Now, as many people in this room, Kathleen Grimm and others can tell you, is our adult education programs have waiting lists. It's a good thing so many people want to go back to adult education. It's bad we don't have enough seats. But there's about 16,000 New Yorkers who will end up getting deported if we do not create these adult education opportunities for them. It's that simple. And that's why we're proposing we allocate $13 million next year to expanding adult education, with the opportunity for these immigrants to get into those classes and then get to stay in New York City. It's not a huge amount of money, it's not a small amount of money, but it's that important, and we will miss this opportunity and miss having those immigrants as a permanent legal part of our city moving forward. So that's something I think we all really need to seize this opportunity on. Let me just move off of the state of the city for 1 second and just say something about Hurricane Sandy. We are in the process now, I think we're about halfway through what in the end will be about a dozen oversight hearings on the city's response to Hurricane Sandy. And that's important, not to say anybody did anything wrong, but because we went through something. Joan Cusack can tell you, who's led the efforts on Staten Island with our great borough president there, and I was actually just out in Fox Beach last week, and boy, you want to talk about strong people. You want to talk people with fortitude, but we need to be as tough and harsh, hard on ourselves as we should be, to make sure, not saying we did anything wrong, but that we are prepared the next time, because you don't get to say twice, this was unprecedented. You only get to say that once. And these oversight hearings are really designed, and the mayor's office is going to come out with reports too, to figure out how we can do it better. But we also need to remain focused, even as the months move away from Sandy, on the work that needs to be done. We're lucky that President Obama has appointed HUD Secretary Sean Donovan from Brooklyn, I'm just saying, to head a regional rebuild. In the month after Hurricane Sandy, the mayor and I re-impaneled, if you will, the Building Resiliency Task Force on an emergency basis, gave them a 6-month charge to come back to us with an update on the building code and flood standards, so we learn what we need to learn. We've always put the boilers and the electricity in the basement, and we all get why we did that. Who wants to take, if you're a developer, the 4th floor where you could rent apartments or offices and put it there? Well, we now learned you'll pay one way or the other, right? So maybe it's better to just plan that way. We learned through looking at things like the Sims plan that when you raise property up, it makes a difference and can preserve structures. We need to make those changes now a permanent part of our building code. We also need to commit to actually implementing a comprehensive system of barriers around New York City. We need to harden the exterior of New York City. Some of those will be man-made barriers. Some of those will be blue belts, some of it will be duning, some of it will be oyster beds, some of it may be places like Fox Beach that will get bought out. People won't rebuild their homes. It'll become part of the blue belt. That has to happen. Now, unlike Stamford, Connecticut, there's no one wall we can put up that's enough, but we can create a network. We also need to put better structure and redundancy into the systems that failed us during the storm. 16% of New York City's electrical power comes from overhead lines. 50% of the people who were out of power during Storm Sandy, some for weeks on end, were people who had overhead lines. That's why we passed legislation in the council to begin the process of coming up with the plan that will show us how, in a prioritized fashion, to begin putting those power lines underground. We need to create redundancy in our gasoline system and in our telecommunications system. You know, immediately during the storm, AT&T and T-Mobile went to network sharing. If you had AT&T or T-Mobile, you probably had service. How often do you hear people say, you know, I am so happy I have T-Mobile? Never. You heard that during the storm. Verizon needs to commit to do the same, which they have yet to do. So all of this, whether it's building housing for the middle class and those trying to get into it, figuring out a child care tax credit so people who are lucky enough to have 2 jobs can go to work, families that have 2 jobs can go to work without real worry about being able to pay the bills or the quality of their child care, making sure we keep this an immigrant city, making sure we create jobs and economic development like we talked about in the speech, or making sure we actually respond with as much grace and dignity and fortitude as those folks who were hit so hard by Sandy. That's some, but a very, very much important work that lies ahead of us in the weeks and months and years. And I just want to thank all of you for being part of this structure in government or your civic or academic involvement, and would be happy to take your questions on any of this or any other stuff you're interested in. So thank you all for being here this morning.
Let me just say, the way we do it here is the microphones, and you line up. You're not going to be called on by hands, but if you line up behind the microphone, we'll take the questions. Let me say before we do that these breakfasts are free, and that is true because We have wonderful support. The law firm of Greenberg Traurig, Ed Wallace is here, one of our major supporters.
Former council member.
Yeah, former council member. Consolidated Edison has been a longtime sponsor, as has Verizon. Forgive me, Verizon, please come back next year.
When you don't read your briefing, you don't learn things like that, and then you don't pull your punches, so I guess it all works out well. I'm sure that was in my briefing, Anthony. Sorry I didn't get to the final page. Yes, sir.
Speaker, the most important mayoral appointment is that of police commissioner. You have repeatedly described Raymond Kelly as one of the best commissioners in the country, and you have said the next mayor will be lucky to retain Raymond Kelly. What does that say about your commitment to civil liberties? I point out that settlements against the NYPD have reached record levels. Marijuana possession arrests and stop, question, and frisk levels have exceeded those under Mayor Rudy Giuliani. So, what does that say about your commitment to civil liberties, your judgment, and are you going to let the bills proposed by the coalition, Communities United for Police Reform, out for a vote, including a creation of an inspector general? NYPD is the only city agency without an inspector general.
So let me say a couple of different things. I believe Ray Kelly has been an outstanding police commissioner. And I think, notwithstanding reports that I have offered him that job, I have no jobs to offer, and I subscribe to the belief that there is a, goddess out there of political hexes, and if you start giving away jobs before you actually have the job, she will cast a hex on you for having too much hubris, and you will lose the position. So people sometimes say to me when I was running for council or speaker, who'll be your chief of staff? You can't even talk of those things? You have a hex put on me. At least I was raised in an Irish family, so my mother used to say, if you took the Christmas tree down before Three Kings Day, your house would be cursed for the rest of the year. So there's a whole bunch of cursing, believing going on in my household. So I did not offer them a job, but I did say, and I stand by, that whoever the next mayor is would be lucky to keep Ray Kelly on as police commissioner, because he has kept crime down to all-time lows. He's begun to tackle crime categories like hate crimes and domestic violence and sexual assault that have persistently almost been impossible to take down. And he's been able to deal with, challenging issues in the police department. Now, look, I also, and I think at times this is unique in New York politics, I believe you can think somebody is outstanding and not agree with everything they do and every way they do it. And I do not believe the way the police department right now is implementing the practice of stop, question, and frisk is correct. I would not stop it. I would keep it as a tool in police officers' toolboxes, but I believe we've become too focused on the quantity of the stop and not the quality of the stop. That's why we had an all-time high number of stops and an extraordinarily low number of guns or weapons or significant contraband found in those stops. That's why we called on the police commissioner to make enormous changes, expansive changes in how training goes around stop, question, and frisk. And I'm grateful that the commissioner put that into place. In response to people's concerns about how stop, question, and frisk have been implemented, that's why we called on the police commissioner to enter into a memorandum of understanding, given the Civilian Complaint Review Board prosecutorial authority, which we haven't had since prior to a lawsuit brought against the Giuliani administration. That has happened. And we have seen numbers go down. Do I think we need more structural changes, a kind of even tighter infrastructure around stop, question, and frisk? Yes, and we are in the midst of ongoing, just even yesterday, I was in negotiations and discussions around the legislation, and we are working towards a correct balance on those.
Let's go to this slide.
Inspector General?
No, let's go to
That's a piece of the legislation, and we are in discussions and negotiations. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, from time to time, I'm in the streets of the city exercising my First Amendment rights of speech and assembly, demonstrating for one cause or another.
In the streets, I thought you were going to disclose your life as a prostitute, and then I thought we were going to have a whole Ray Kelly problem, and I was going to urge you to stop talking because Ozzy is here taping, and could get ugly. Go ahead.
What do you say to that? I thought
What do you say to that? I know.
And so I have a question that also relates to the NYPD. It's a very specific question.
Okay.
Because during the Occupy Wall Street events, I observed, and maybe many of us did here as well, that the police had fielded, but were not deploying or switching on so-called long-range acoustic devices or sound cannons as a potential crowd control
I'm sorry, did
device.
you say sound cannons?
Yes, sound cannons.
Okay.
And I wasn't referring to the speaker. I was referring to these mounted...
I would not take it as an insult, so it would
No,
be
and I
completely
meant
wrong.
it as
It
a
might even
compliment.
be an accurate description, but
meant as a compliment.
I take it as such.
And with the help of Donna Lieberman and the New York Civil Liberties Union, I foiled the police department out of concern for the acoustic capabilities of these devices. And what I got back is essentially that in certain modes, these devices can, the sound emissions from these devices can reach levels that can be piercing and that can damage human hearing. So frankly, I'm concerned...
Must be terrible for animals if they're nearby too,
Well,
right?
but in-
no, seriously, I mean, I don't mean that as a joke.
No,
seriously, yeah.
but in all seriousness now,
Yeah.
I'm concerned about a scenario in which, due to improper training
Right.
or the heat of the moment or
Right.
malice or carelessness, whatever, that these devices could inadvertently cause permanent hearing damage to dozens, hundreds of New Yorkers exercising their First Amendment rights. So I want to ask, do you share my concern, and what would you do about that?
To be very honest with you, this is the first time I've heard of this. So if I could ask, you're standing right next to Liz Feiner, General Counsel, if you would share that information with them, we'll take a look at it. This is the first I've heard of it, but we will absolutely take a look at it. Make sure we also have your contact information, so we'll follow up, and we can follow up with Donna, who we were just with yesterday as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Madam Speaker.
Good
It's a
morning.
pleasure and honor.
Thank you.
I just want to know your stance on the issue. You mentioned in your speech infrastructure, and you mentioned also the middle income. I want to know what's your stance on, on March 3rd, 2013, the tolls are going to go up to $7.50. Okay, right now it's currently $6.50 cash to go across most East River crossings. The Verrazano is currently at $13. Okay, and it's going to now go up to $15 one way. I mean, if my math is correct, that's going to be $75 a week, 5 days a week, $300 a month for a person traveling to Staten Island or New Jersey via the Verrazano Bridge. We really need to discuss alternatives in regards to these tolls. I mean, the prices is going up. And, you mentioned middle income. I consider myself the middle income. I call New York home. But each year, I find it a challenge to keep up with the cost of living in New York, okay? And what's a little disheartening to me is a couple of days ago, I read in the New York Post, and it stated there was an audit by the New York State Comptroller's Office that said that the MTA has incorrect money in certain accounts,
Right.
or to a certain degree. And this is a little disheartening to read in the next upcoming weeks that they're going to do an increase on these toll bridges. I mean,
That's a good question. Let her
I'm
answer.
sorry. What are our alternatives? Is there any alternatives being discussed in regards to the tolls?
And let me just add into the tolls, because you could ask that question in a different moment, and who knows, maybe even some moment in the future, and put the word subway fares in there, right? So, this is an issue both around tolls and the other charges that New Yorkers get from the MTA as well. And I share your very right and very correct concern that costs like that from New Yorkers just seem to go up and go up and go up. And questions remain on a very significant level that have been out there and never really addressed for a long time. And I think the Comptroller's audit re-raises these questions in a way that we have to look at. Real structural concerns about the MTA's budget, the MTA's funding, where is the money going? Just a couple of years ago, there was a proposal from the MTA to stop doing Metro cards for high school students. And we had to do, with the strap hangers and others, a citywide organizing campaign to prevent that cut from going into place. So I would suspect, though I don't want to speak for the MTA, that there isn't a really robust effort going on to find alternatives, but there needs to be, and we need to get greater transparency, clarity within the MTA's budget, and find ways to try to stop and soften these constant increases that are going on. And look at the numbers you raised just around Staten Island. I mean, that really prohibits a Staten Islander's efforts, particularly if they're maybe starting out in a job where they're not making a lot yet, and it's hours where it's hard to take mass transit. I mean, there's reasons people actually have to drive at times. That could make it hard for somebody to take that job that maybe isn't a lot today, but could put them on the path, you know what I mean, to a good job. So I share your concern. I unfortunately don't have a great answer that. I think they are looking at those alternatives, but I do think that's something that has to be squarely on our to-do list to hold the MTA more accountable.
All right,
And it'll
thank
be
you.
something for a new mayor's appointments to really take up in a big way.
Please, thank you.
Let me just say there's quite a few people standing, so I would ask that the questions be short or the comments be short.
Jim O'Neill, President of the Sports and Arts and Schools Foundation. I want to thank you for your leadership on the council fighting massive cuts that have existed for many years, and I think one of your great achievements as Speaker has been supporting after school. However, there is a concern among our after-school movement that many of the middle-income neighborhoods of New York City are not receiving any after-school programs. The eligibility rules have changed where there just is very little money going into middle-income communities. How do we, in addition to child credit, basically try to look at that problem? Thank you very much.
Well, I mean, it's in part a question of funding, which is not an easy answer, but is part of the answer, which means at times there'll be enough and at times there won't be enough. You know, because a budget is ultimately a document of priorities. And you always want to try to prioritize things like after-school programs and particularly programs that focus on young people. But you can't, if you're in the position I'm in, ever say absolutely we'll be able to do it all the time, because you just, honestly, I don't mean to get, you don't know the realities. But that's one thing, right? One. Two, to try to find efforts to have greater public partnership. Three, to try to have a slightly more textured process in these things. You know, last year there was, I think it was last year, might have been the year before, a proposal to cut back on beacons, to target beacon resources to lower income neighborhoods, which is a logical perspective. But one of the challenges in how that was done was it looked just, I believe, at census tract info. That will lose things like housing developments in the middle of Chelsea, or large groupings of rent-protected homes or Michelin or things of that nature, where you have lots of families who are not going to have the ability to pay for after-school classes. Now, we were able, through the budget negotiation process, to fix that, but as we all search in government, and this is not a criticism of any of us, for data and indicators that show us how to prioritize, we need to understand that sometimes it's a little more than the numbers, and you need to get to the context beneath that. And that's the good thing about a public budget process, is there's the opportunity for folks like you to say, I get it, but you missed this. You know, and that's a good thing, and that's why you have give and take and back and forth, and hopefully in the end you get it close to right.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I have a question about housing. You brought up an issue of increasing the affordable housing in New York City. Presently, there's over 500,000 people who live in NYCHA housing, which New York City and New York State doesn't provide any funding for. How would you address the problems of New York City Housing Authority, and how to continue the housing for over 500,000 New Yorkers?
You know, there are enormous problems at NYCHA, and some of those problems have really, through the good work of the Daily News lately, becoming more front and center, which I think is a great thing. You know, when you have systems like $5 million worth of warehouse and supplies, and then a $5 million contract to oversee those, there's a problem with the numbers, right? You don't have to be an accountant. Or when you have supplies that are just not even inventoried and they're going bad because you don't know when they expire, that's ridiculous. Or when you have situations like Hurricane Sandy where you can't really even get an answer on what is wrong structurally before you can fix it, that is an enormous problem. Now, I think there's another problem. You know, is funding, and does NYCHA need more funding? Yes. But NYCHA isn't even using all the funding it has, in my opinion, accurately, effectively, or even drawing it down. There are, by some accounting, significant amount of federal money that NYCHA could have accessed that are still in Washington, and other monies that are still within NYCHA's own budget. These are problems, and it's part of the reason why I think we need to explore the idea of looking at something like a school construction authority type model for NYCHA to pull out the construction rehab part of what needs to get done in NYCHA, to separate that so management can focus on structural management and day-to-day issues. It's something we're working on with IAF now to look at how we could develop that model. Last year in the budget, we allocated $10 million to help NYCHA deal with its work order backlog and to help get more work done more quickly in NYCHA, with the caveat that that money had to be used to train and hire NYCHA residents to do the work. So it was an opportunity to give more resources and to get NYCHA residents work, most of those ending up becoming union jobs in Teamsters 237. So I think there's a lot of work to get done. That's a short answer to an enormous problem. There's a number of other things that have to get done. We need really focused management, and I think NYCHA is in a state that none of us are satisfied with. But the opportunity there is we can make it better, and we can bring that housing to what it should be like. And look, part of the point here is people pay rent every day in NYCHA. They should get what they're paying for. They should get quality places to live. And I think there is no reason why we can't get NYCHA. Yes, we need more money. Yes, we need to advocate for that in Washington. Yes, we need to push for that when we have city resources and when we have state resources. But that's no reason to say we can't improve it. We're not going to wait till we get that money, because I believe there's structural and management changes we can make that can start us to turn the corner.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andrea Wong-Miller. I'm with HR&A Advisors. We're a real estate consulting firm, and my questions have to do with economic development, especially in relation to our city being competitive as a global city. So I'm interested in hearing about what industries you're interested in attracting and retaining.
All of them.
If there's particular ones you want to focus on, and also how do you propose to do it, especially in relation to innovation and tech sectors. And then how can we make sure our workforce is prepared to be qualified for those positions?
Well, one of the things we announced in the State of the City speech is a kind of a neighborhood-based economic development policy plan, and we're calling it Keeping Opportunities Close to Home, KOTCH. In case you didn't get the acronym quickly in your own mind, because we thought we would get haunted by Mayor Koch if we didn't mention him a number of times in the State of the City speech. But the idea being, we've seen under Mayor Bloomberg, and the mayor deserves a lot of credit for this, things like Hudson Yards and, rezoning large tracts of land, and that kind of top-down economic development plan has generated a lot of jobs, will create new neighborhoods, good economic development. We also think you need to add a bottom-up approach at neighborhood development. What are the assets of our neighborhoods? What are the industries that are already out there with growth potential? And then as a government, help facilitate that potential to go even further. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In Brooklyn, one of our great successes is the Brooklyn Navy Yard, right? A facility that had kind of dwindled really into nothing, a remnant of the city's, great past. Actually, I just found out recently, it's funny, my father had been stationed there. I said something to him about, wasn't your ship, serviced or built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard? He was like, oh yeah, and I was stationed there. I was like, not for nothing. I've been the speaker for 7 years. You think you could give me like a good Brooklyn fact there I could have been using for a while. But anyway, he was stationed there. Apparently the war was over. He was stationed there briefly. He heard there were ships that were going to be, people were going to be dispatched out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard who would get on ships that would get to go to Europe. His ship went to Boston and then stopped there. And he was in charge of shore patrol for a long time, which is another story about getting people out of bars, which we won't go into today. But amazingly successful, Brooklyn Navy Yard. 3,000 new manufacturing jobs there during the recession. Why? In part, a very interesting and creative managerial structure, where the city forgoes getting money back from the Navy Yard, and the money just cycles through the Navy Yard over and over and over. So let's look at what other neighborhoods have this potential. Because you might say, well, look, you got one Navy Yard, what are you going to do? Well, in Sunset Park, you have the Brooklyn Army Terminal. You have the Bush Terminal. You have the Marine Terminal. We believe if we put a similar type of focus and managerial structure in place at those terminals, we could bring 2,000 new jobs to Sunset Park. Now, what's another area of our city that has great potential and great kind of just by definition of where it is and what it is? Staten Island's waterfront. New York City, and I was so gratified that we talked about this on Monday and President Obama talked about it on Tuesday. New York City and the nation do not lead in exporting. New York City lags behind other cities in exporting. Let's decide we're going to double our exports by 2020. Let's decide we are going to export those out of Staten Island. Create products in Brooklyn, take them to Staten Island, use Staten Island's ports to get them to other places. We develop that potential on Staten Island. Those are good jobs for people. So those are two examples. But let's also seize the potential of the tech industry, right? The tech industry is a key part, not the only part, but a key part of what has brought Dumbo to what it is today. Great tech potential at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Let's take those back office spaces in downtown Brooklyn that we don't need in that way anymore, make them tech spaces. That's why we're working with NYU and Polytech on a study on how to create a Brooklyn tech triangle. Do you know today in downtown Brooklyn there will be more students, college and postgraduate students, than there will be in Cambridge, Massachusetts today? We can be a tech triangle. We can be the college hub of America. We just need to seize the potential that's there that we've never really focused and harnessed. So those are some of the ways we can do it by neighborhood. What else can we do? Growing on tech? Let's think of the potential of the Queens side of Roosevelt Island. Those old factories and warehouse spaces that are there in Long Island City that other cities might tear down as vestiges of the past we don't need anymore. No, let's turn them into tech incubators. We're already talking to an investor that I met in Jerusalem, around Margalit, about turning one of those spaces into that. That's the other thing that we can keep going, and there's other examples. Let me just give you another neighborhood example. Let me give you another industry example, healthcare. We have still vacancies in important healthcare positions. We've been successful and helpful, the council there, as it relates to home health aides and nurses, but there's more we can do. But more significantly than that, with the changes on the federal and state level around healthcare, we have new positions that will be created that we as a state will have to define, create trainings, create accreditations for. We need to do that in a way that New Yorkers get those jobs. We also have 3,000 home health aides right now. All of home health aides are going to have to be recertified. We have 3,000 home health aides right now who are non-English speaking, which is a great opportunity for clients who need a non-English speaking home health aide. The tests that exist on the state and federal level are only in English. Simply by committing to translating the test and the training material, we can make sure those 3,000 New Yorkers don't lose their jobs, as well as really a countless amount of other healthcare jobs, which is why in the State of the City speech, I announced a partnership with Greater New York Hospital Association, Local 1199, CUNY, being co-chaired by our Health Committee Chair, Maria del Carmen Arroyo, to begin that planning and implementation for New York City.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Tamara Salzman. I'm a 2L here at NYLS, and I'm a member of the Center for Real Estate Studies. You had mentioned updating the building codes, and I was just curious how you think that may affect currently landmarked buildings that are facing restoration and renovation due to damage from Sandy.
You know, that's a good question. You know, most of what the building code is going to look at, a lot of what the building code is going to look at is new construction, but there will obviously be requirements around rebuild. And landmarks issues always adds a complicated overlay onto whatever these questions are. But with anything, there has to be a balance, right, between the real challenges and dangers that we know exist for our buildings as a result of climate change. So I'm neither a building code expert nor, thank God, a landmarks expert, but that's exactly the kind of question that our building resiliency task force, which is comprised exactly of all of those experts, is going to look at.
Thank you.
Yep.
Roger Hers, time, an acronym to improve municipal efficiency. My question is about congestion pricing, and I want to thank you for your early and strong support in our last round. I was initially disappointed when the state legislature didn't have the courage to vote on April 7th, 2008. I am increasingly thankful they did not. That was a very low level of pricing, similar to London, and we can now do a lot better than that, particularly with GPS. How do you project the next couple of years on this subject?
I don't anticipate congestion pricing coming back around. It didn't do well, and I don't expect a similar, I don't accept that proposal to come back around in that way. I think we can take one more, right, Anthony? Yep. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Madam Speaker. Thank you for coming to New York Law School to speak this morning.
Sure.
You briefly discussed homelessness earlier in your speech. It's evident that it's a problem in New York and the need for more shelters and centers and education facilities. There is currently in Carroll Gardens, I'm a resident, they're trying to put a homeless shelter on 9th Street with 170 homeless, I think it's all men.
I think that's right.
Homeless men in a building, in a condominium building that was built pre-recession that has 10 apartments. This is an area that there's 2 schools about 3 blocks away from there, and this homeless shelter is coming in through an emergency contract method. And this process is very corrupt. There's a gentleman named Alan Lapis, L-A-P-E-S, who's run Hotel Aladdin on the west side, which is very
Yeah, no, I'm familiar
it's an
with
issue.
hotels.
It's an issue, and he pretty much got
Could you
this
please
job.
bring your question?
Yeah, I'll bring my question. He got this job through his connections with political offices in New York. But anyways, my question is, you speak about the need for more transparency, and I guess my question is the issue around this emergency contract method of issuing homeless shelters and the need for more transparency and what we should do to overhaul this process.
Well, let me back up a little bit, because I think, the debate around homeless right now is mostly around kind of the issue you raised around shelters and emergency shelters and other sightings of shelters, and you hear it in your neighborhood, you hear it on the Upper West Side. I was with someone recently who asked me if she should sell her apartment on the Upper West Side. I told her not to do that, obviously. But the real question is, why aren't we focusing on expanding the exit out of the homeless shelter? I mean, look, the facts are we are at an all-time high in the homeless shelter population right now. In part, in my opinion, and the opinion of some of our leading and best advocates in this area, it is because there is no significant exit door out of the shelter anymore. We used to have a voucher program. Now, there was debate about whether Advantage was the best structured program or not, but at least we had a voucher program that helped people go out and get apartments. Last year in my State of the City, we proposed recreating a voucher program that would give folks that exit opportunity. We pushed for it in the budget last year, would have actually even funded it out of kind of the council side of the budget, if you will, and we're unable to get that done. So there are big questions about transparency, about what is allowed under emergency. We're having a debate in my district about what is 200, what isn't 200. You're good. Your head would explode talking to lawyers about that. I want to scream all the time. But the real question is, we shouldn't even have to be having that conversation as much as we're having that conversation if we actually had a plan to get folks out of the shelter system and into housing. But clearly there are questions about how shelters are being sited. I see it in my own district, your neighborhood, and the Upper West Side that deserve greater clarity and more conversation. But let's not forget the part of it about getting folks out so they can really start their lives, which is ultimately what we all want for homeless individuals and for everybody, to become great parts of Carroll Gardens, to become great parts of Chelsea, to be able to stay there and live in those neighborhoods. Well, thank you all for coming out. Have a great weekend and a fun 3-day weekend, I hope.
I want to thank Speaker Christine Quinn for demonstrating once again just how broadly her interests are and how superbly she can analyze these very important programs. As we always do at these breakfasts, though, we'd like to give to our speakers a product of the scholarship of New York Law School, and I'd like to present to the Speaker my book by my colleague Jethro Lieberman, Liberalism Undressed, a super book, and I thank you for everybody. And from Anthony Crowell, who really missed being here.
Thanks,
Thank you all.
everybody. Bye.
See you.
See you later.